This week in wrestling history, we begin all the way back 49 years ago. This week, on December 13th, 1971, a most important date in Japanese wrestling history, WWE Hall of Famer Antonio Inoki was fired from the Japan Wrestling Association after a failed coup to take over the promotion with Giant Baba. The only reason Baba wasn't fired was because he was their top star at the time, so Inoki took the fall. The following year, Inoki founded a new promotion of his own called New Japan Pro Wrestling. In that same year, Baba left the JWA to form All Japan Pro Wrestling. Both companies are still going today. The JWA, meanwhile, without its two biggest names, it didn't really stand a chance, and they folded in 1973. 34 years ago this week, on December 13th, 1986, in a match in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, pitting the British Bulldogs against Don Morocco and Cowboy Bob Orton, Dynamite Kid suffered a nearly career-ending back injury. He did come back from it, but he was never the same again after this. I mean, it's almost like BC AD in terms of the tale of two careers. The Dynamite Kid, as people knew him and remembered him, that kind of performer, he basically died on this day. He was never the same after this. Watching the fan cam footage, there just so happened to be a fan filming, and this was in 1986, and at some live event, and this fan happened to be filming. So if you look around on YouTube, you can find the fan cam footage. The footage of the spot where the injury happened, it's hardly some kind of big bump that Dynamite Kid took. His body just gave out after years of abuse. He wrestled a very, very hard in-ring style. Being roided up, I'm sure, to the gills didn't help. I'm sure that contributed to the breakdown of his body. But he hit the ropes, and he took a knee to the back by Don Morocco on the apron. Morocco just kind of lifted his knee up, referee didn't see it, and he crumbled to the mat, but it wasn't the knee that did it. He wrote in his book that he was in mid-stride jumping over Orton to go hit the ropes, and as soon as he jumped in the air mid-stride, so he didn't even hit the ropes yet, he felt something in his back just go. And nobody realized how hurt he was. He managed to tag out to Davey Boy Smith. He spent the rest of the match laying on the apron. He had to be stretchered out of the building, had surgery to repair two torn lumbar discs in his back, and he ended up with really bad nerve damage. He wrestled on for a few years, I think up until 91. Didn't wrestle again, I don't think, until 1996. And you find footage of that tag match that he was part of in 96, and how much smaller he looks. It's really, really striking. But he wrestled his last match in 96, and he spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair. 32 years ago, on December 13th, 1988, the AWA held its one and only pay-per-view as an interpromotional event with world class called Superclash III. Two promotions that were near death and were definitely off their peak from many years earlier, working together. They only drew about 1,600 people live in the building, had about 40,000 buys on pay-per-view. The show featured a title unification match between Jerry Lawler as the AWA World Champion and Kerry Von Erich as the World Class Champion. And there's a couple of interesting stories to this. The match ended by ref stoppage, with Lawler unifying titles due to excessive blood loss by Von Erich. Before the match, in the back, and I think, and Lawler talked about this, I think, in his book and also on his podcast. The plan was for the stoppage to come due to a cut on Kerry's forehead. So Kerry would cut himself, and there would be so much blood that the referee would just have no choice but to stop the match. So Kerry taped a blade to his finger to use late in the match. And a lot of wrestlers did that. They would tape the blade either to their finger, they would keep it in their mouth, which always freaked me out when I heard that, or they would tape it in their wrist tape. And there's actually video from a video that Jimmy Garvin shot backstage at some of the Great American Bash shows that WCW, or I guess NWA did. It might have been the Great American Bash 88. But he took a whole series of home movies that eventually he put out online. And it's the craziest thing because this is back in like prime 1980s, and he's walking around in the locker room, and they're all sitting around getting ready for their match, and there's Sting and there's Luger, and of course Hawk and Animal are just being all nutty. Well, Hawk is being nutty. But you get to see these guys in their prime sitting there taping the blades, and they're showing you, okay, here's where I put it. And so anyway, that was commonplace. That's how they did it. And in this case, Kerry decided to tape the blade to his finger. While he was in the dressing room, though, this is before the match, right? They're getting ready. He's in the dressing room. He forgot. He was a little absent-minded, which I guess Kerry Von Erich was known to be for various reasons. And he just forgot himself for a second. Forgot that he had a blade taped to his index finger. He went to go scratch himself under the arm. It's a good thing his eye didn't itch. Or he wasn't reaching for a booger up his nose. But he had an itch under his arm, and he went to go scratch himself, and when he did, he sliced his bicep, like deep. This was not like a paper cut. He sliced his bicep open under the arm, and blood started shooting out. Lawler said blood was shooting out like crazy. There wasn't enough time to get the wound closed. They tried to put tape on it, but he had to get out there. They had a match to do. So in the first 60 seconds of the match, Lawler grabs Kerry by the arm, and he sort of rams the arm into the top turnbuckle, just as a way that they could explain why his arm was bleeding, why his arm had a gash on it, which the announcers acknowledged. On TV the following week, Kerry said that he was cut by a Jerry Lawler fan with a knife on his way to the ring, which is why his arm was bleeding. He just said that as a way to cover for it. No such knifing took place, other than the one Kerry gave himself. But the other thing that happened, one of many stories of Vince McMahon playing dirty, which makes me laugh every time I think about him whining about Billionaire Ted in the 90s. This is from the December 19, 1988 issue of the Wrestling Observer. Allegedly, Vince McMahon tried to get the match canceled by alerting the state commission in the state of Illinois that there was an amputee wrestling on the show. In the state of Illinois at the time, there was some obscure rule on the books that no one with any artificial limbs could compete in any kind of, competition in the state. And it was an open secret at that point that Kerry had lost his foot in a motorcycle accident. Even though he never admitted it publicly, certainly not up to that point, he wanted to keep that under wraps. And I think Bill Apter, he had promised Bill Apter to, take a picture that night in the back at some point of his foot or whatever, and Kerry kept dodging him and putting him off. And then finally, Kerry just said to him, look, just tell them that you saw it and the foot looked fine. Like, he just did not want to come out with it. So people knew, but they didn't know. Certainly the public didn't know. I didn't know when I was watching the Texas Tornado. When I was in my young wrestling fandom, I had no idea that he had lost his foot. Vince McMahon knew. And so he tried to get the match canceled. Vince tipped off the commission. The commission then scheduled a hearing for the day after the pay-per-view, which Vince apparently was furious about. So he went to court to try to get the hearing rescheduled to a few days before the show. Kerry happened to be on tour at that time in Japan, so he couldn't be there. So the commission, and I think the commission knew what was going on here. I don't think these people are stupid. I think they knew what he was trying to do. So, he's trying to cause mischief. And they were probably fed up with his shit. So they ruled that wrestling was fake, the rule did not apply, and they said that even if it was a legitimate competition, they have the power to grant exceptions, and they likely would be granting one in this case anyway. And so since he obviously wasn't going to get what he wanted, McMahon just dropped the whole issue, and that was that. And it's interesting that when he signed Kerry a few years later to come to the WWF, I'm sure that Kerry must have wrestled in the state of Illinois a few times, right? Probably some Chicago shows for WWF. Funny, I don't think Vince McMahon raised the issue then of him being an amputee. See, ruthless aggression was not just a catchphrase that he came up with years later. It was a lifestyle for Vince McMahon back in the 80s. 31 years ago this week, on December 12th, 1989, at a TV taping in Nashville, Tennessee, WWE taped No Holds Barred, The Match, The Movie, which was a double billing that aired on pay-per-view right after Christmas, where they aired the movie first, followed by the match inside a steel cage pitting Hulk Hogan and Brutus the Barber Beefcake against Zeus and the Macho King. And it was the final appearance that Zeus would make in the WWF. If you want to watch the match, it's only about 10 minutes long. It's a relatively short match. You can find it, though, on the WWE Network. It is at the end of Super Tape Volume 1, which is under the Coliseum Video or the Home Video section on the network. I think it's the first Super Tape, because there were a whole bunch of Super Tapes, and I'm pretty sure it's on there at the end. So if you want to watch it, that's the place you can go find it. 23 years ago this week, on December 7th, 1997, WWE held its Degeneration X In Your House pay-per-view, and on this night, Triple H beat then-Commissioner Sergeant Slaughter in a boot camp match, and he needed help from China to do. How pathetic. How pathetic. Triple H needed help from a woman to beat almost 50-year-old Sergeant Slaughter. But I guess that's how heels get heat in WWE. So Triple H won the boot camp match. Jeff Jarrett got a disqualification win over The Undertaker when Kane interfered and he gave old Double J a chokeslam. I had completely forgotten that this match even happened, but it will go down in the record books as a pay-per-view win for Jeff Jarrett over The Undertaker. Shawn Michaels retained his WWE title over Ken Shamrock in the main event by DQ. After the match, Owen Hart returned. For the first time since the Montreal Screwjob, he attacked Shawn Michaels. Owen had wanted to leave and join his brother and join the British Bulldog, who bought himself out of his own contract. He wanted to go join them in WCW. Vince McMahon would not let him leave. Owen was the one Hart that Vince McMahon would not let him out of his contract. But that should have been the title match at the Royal Rumble in '98. Instead, they blew off the match between Shawn Michaels and Owen Hart on TV a few weeks later because I guess Vince McMahon wasn't quite done fucking over members of the Hart family. Also on this show, Stone Cold Steve Austin, he retained his Intercontinental title over The Rock, their first ever one-on-one match on pay-per-view, their first of many. The next night, on Monday Night Raw, Austin forfeited the Intercontinental Championship to The Rock because he said, quote, "I have bigger fish to fry." That being the WWF title. And, I guess they didn't want to beat Austin. So instead, they just had him literally hand the belt over. He handed the belt over to Rocky Maivia, and then he laid him out with a stunner. And then he stole the belt, and the week after on TV, he tossed it off a bridge into a river. Now, if that isn't a burial of the belt, then I don't know what is. He literally buried it at the bottom of the sea. It was also the fourth time that year, in 1997, that Steve Austin lost a championship without actually being beat for that title. That has got to be a record. That has to be. I don't think there's ever been anybody else in that company where in a single calendar year lost that many championships without actually being pinned or submitted or beaten straight up for it. I don't think that's probably happened before or since. He won the tag team titles with Shawn Michaels, and then the titles were vacated when Shawn, had his little cat fight in the bathroom with Bret Hart, and he got sent home. He won the tag team titles with Dude Love after that, and then vacated those after Owen Hart dropped him on his head, and he couldn't defend them. And he vacated the IC title for the same reason, due to injury. And now here, he just hands it over to The Rock. 21 years ago this week, on December 12th, 1999, WWE presented its first Armageddon pay-per-view, notable for a few reasons. We got nudity on a WWE pay-per-view after Miss Kitty won an evening gown swimming pool match to win the women's championship. The women's division was just a dumpster fire at this point. But back then it wasn't so much about having good matches on WWE television with the women. In fact, it wasn't about that at all on WWE television. It was about sex, and more sex. Which is why after the match was over, Miss Kitty decided to flash the world before Sergeant Slaughter quickly wrapped a towel around her naked body and whisked her away. And it was not censored. I don't know what they do on the network now. They probably cut that whole scene out. Or maybe they censor it. But when it aired live, there was no censor. Young me did not forget that. And then Mae Young. I also didn't forget this. Mae Young tried to do the same thing. After they carried her away, Mae Young was there. She was, I guess, the MC of ceremonies. And Mae Young tried to do the same thing. Thank God she was stopped. Sadly, I would be scarred for life the following month at the Royal Rumble when she was not stopped. And all I can say is why? Why did nobody stop her? Why? Chris Jericho beat Chyna to win his first, I guess of 9, right? Intercontinental titles in WWE. He's a 10-time Intercontinental Champion. One of those, though, was the IWGP. So this was his first Intercontinental title win. The Big Show pinned the Big Boss Man in one of the worst WWE title matches I have ever seen. And Triple H beat Vince McMahon in the main event to win a shot at the WWE Championship. Had he lost, his marriage to Stephanie McMahon would have been annulled. After the match, Stephanie embraced Triple H and turned heel, and the McMahon-Helmsley regime was officially formed. 19 years ago this week, on December 9th, 2001, Stone Cold's final night as WWE Champion. This was the Vengeance pay-per-view where they crowned a new undisputed champion. The invasion was over. Austin was back to being a babyface as the WWE Champion. The Rock was the WCW Champion. And they hosted a little mini tournament with Austin defending against Kurt Angle and The Rock defending against Chris Jericho. The winners of those two matches would go on to meet in the main event to crown, I guess, an undisputed WWE Champion. Austin pinned Kurt Angle. Jericho pinned The Rock. And Jericho pinned Austin in the main event with an assist from Booker T to become the undisputed champ, something that he does not miss a chance to this very day to let everybody know that he beat Stone Cold and The Rock in the very same night. And at no point after being the undisputed champion was he ever positioned as the top guy in the company. You would think that this guy, my God, he beat Austin and The Rock, he unified the titles. He's got to be the biggest thing in wrestling. Far from it. Didn't help that a couple of months later, Hogan, Hall, and Nash came into the company, and by then he was completely overshadowed. So he may have been the undisputed champion, but he sure didn't feel like it. But, you just look at the amount of talent and star power on the roster at that time. You had Stone Cold, The Rock, Chris Jericho, Kurt Angle, Undertaker, Kane. Ric Flair had just returned to be the 50-50 owner of the company with Vince McMahon. You had Big Show, Booker T, Rob Van Dam, Chris Benoit. They got Triple H back a month later. Eddie Guerrero, he was back on the Indies during this period. He eventually came back to the company in 2002, so they got Eddie Guerrero back. Like I said, we were only a couple of months away from Hulk Hogan and Scott Hall and Kevin Nash coming in. Brock Lesnar debuted a few months later. Shawn Michaels came out of retirement that year in 2002. John Cena, Randy Orton, and Batista, they all made their debuts in 2002, so they were part of the young guard coming in. Just an insane amount of talent that they had in that company in 2001 into 2002, and what would eventually be the whole SmackDown 6 period of SmackDown, which made SmackDown the A show. Just an incredible amount of talent. Also on this pay-per-view, we had the first match between Matt and Jeff Hardy, with Lita as the guest referee. This flopped because nobody wanted to see Matt wrestle his brother. And Undertaker won the hardcore title from RVD. So it makes even more sense why The Undertaker chose to wrestle Ric Flair at WrestleMania 18 when Vince McMahon presented him with the options of who he could work with. The two options that were given to him, and this is The Undertaker telling the story, were Rob Van Dam and Ric Flair. And he didn't even hesitate for a second to say Ric Flair. Now, he probably would have said Flair anyway, because you don't get too many chances to work a WrestleMania match with the guy that you grew up watching. But again, I had forgotten that he and RVD had a match on pay-per-view a few months before. So why the hell would he want to work with him again if he just worked with the guy a few months earlier? Of course he would want to work with Ric Flair. Triple H was featured on the poster for this pay-per-view because even though he never appeared, because they had asked his doctor, the company asked his doctors months earlier, do you think he could be back by December? Do you think we can get him back by the end of the year? And they were told that it was possible. So just picture that meme, right? Vince McMahon. So you're saying it's possible. So they took that to mean, okay, great, we're going to get Triple H back by the end of the year. Unfortunately, he wasn't quite ready to come back yet. He needed another month. So even though he was on the poster for the show, he had absolutely nothing to do with this pay-per-view and was not there. By the time they realized that he wouldn't be ready, these posters and things, they go into development months in advance. They didn't have a chance to change it. 6 years ago this week, on December 11th, 2014, NXT presented its TakeOver Our Evolution show, featuring one of my favorite TakeOver main events ever, with Sami Zayn challenging for and finally winning the big one. He beat Adrian Neville to become the new NXT champion, his first and only title in NXT. And celebrating when the match was over with his best friend who had just debuted in NXT that night, Kevin Owens. He had debuted earlier in the night, breaking his nose in a match against CJ Parker. After the match, Owens attacked his best friend and powerbombed him on the ring apron. Some other notes on this show. Corey Graves announced his retirement from the ring on the kickoff show due to a series of concussions, but also announced that he was starting a brand new career as an announcer, which he started that night. And Finn Balor debuted his new demon persona on this show, wearing the body paint for the very first time in NXT. Obviously, he did the body paint stuff elsewhere and in New Japan, but this was the first time he had debuted the body paint in NXT. He was tagging with Hideo Itami in a win over the Ascension. CJ Parker is now doing big things in New Japan as Juice Robinson. And Itami returned to Japan as Kenta and would probably like to forget that his run as Hideo Itami ever happened. The guy just could not stay healthy. And finally, 3 years ago this week on December 10th, 2017, the reigning Impact World Champion, Rich Swann, was at the time working for WWE and preparing to meet Drew Gulak on Monday Night Raw that week in a number one contenders match for the Cruiserweight title, for a shot at the Cruiserweight title, but he was arrested in Gainesville, Florida, and charged with battery as well as kidnapping and false imprisonment after an incident involving his wife, who wrestles for Impact as Su Yung. They had an argument in their car, and she jumped out of the car while it was still moving. And when Swann, he would not stop, she, jumped out of the car or got out of the car. A witness told police that he then got out of the car, put her in a headlock, and forced her back inside the car. Prosecutors later dropped all of the charges against Swann due to insufficient evidence, but the damage was done, and he and WWE, after initially being suspended by the company, a few months later in February, they both agreed to mutually part ways. And as I mentioned, Swann has found new success in Impact Wrestling and is currently the Impact World Champion as I am recording this. And that is this week in wrestling history.